All right, everyone, welcome to Church Checkpoints episode 12. I'm running solo tonight. We are winding down here for the summer. We're going to have another couple weeks of episodes for you, and then we're going to go on break until September. So stick around and enjoy the next couple of weeks. This week, we're going over Matthew 5, 10 through 12. It's the end of the Beatitudes in our summer series here. And a lot of this week was kind of revolving around the topic of persecution of the church and of sticking through persecution and enduring. So that's what we're going to be talking over. I'm going to read the Bible verses first of all to give us a background here. It says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." And this week, Claire was doing our preaching, and one of the points she made is it's really interesting. A lot of the time in stories, you expect something to end on a high note or with a lot of jubilation here. And so it's really interesting that at the end of the Beatitudes, it actually says, no, you will be persecuted in my name. You will go through pain. You will go through trials. And we are to be enduring through that. And we are to be positive about those trials and persecutions in the name of the Lord. This is one of the things that we are going to go through. And the first point in the sermon was to expect opposition. And part of the sermon was talking about how, sometimes you're in a family and families act differently in different circumstances, and one family that does things one way doesn't do things another way. And so Claire was talking about how when she was younger, her dad would talk to her when she would wonder why the family didn't do things a certain way. Well, this is just who we are. This is our family, right? And so she's kind of relating that to the family of God, and we're the same way. Under the family of God, there's a certain way that we act, and we can't act in opposition to that. And so it's similar that, we have this inherited family traits in the family of God, and it just prevents us from acting outside of that. And people will look at that and they won't understand that. And so there's going to be opposition to that. And this week I was watching an interesting documentary on the persecution of the church in China right now, and how in China there's actually been sort of a crackdown on Christians there, and Christians who are basically trying to run independent churches. So over there, all the churches have to be sanctioned by the Communist Party. And so there's a whole bunch of rules and regulations that they have to go through. And so there are actually people who have tried to set up independent churches, and some of them have had to flee the country. And one story that was really heartbreaking was that there was this woman with a child, and her husband was actually taken in for questioning and detention, and she was so afraid that she actually wound up fleeing the country to somewhere in Thailand with her son. And so sometimes, persecution can be more or less in different places, but I thought one of the points that Claire made that was really good is, persecution is not just, you stubbing your toe on something, or, somebody smirking at you the wrong way. There's a certain level that something has to rise to in order to really qualify for persecution. And so I think that's important, because sometimes maybe we can sort of overplay our own struggles that we go through and consider something persecution when maybe it doesn't quite really count as that. And it was really interesting this week, kind of like thinking about that and then watching this documentary about persecution of the church in China kind of really put things in perspective for me. It was like, okay, yeah, this looks a lot more like persecution than, somebody thinking that you're a little weird because you go to church. That doesn't quite rise to that level. Not that there aren't, I think, forms of persecution. Like I can think of if like you're denied a promotion at your job or something like that, I think maybe you could start to think about rising to the level of persecution. Once again, I think there are different levels, and so that's not like on the same level of being afraid for your life and having to flee a country. But I think maybe that gets a little bit closer to being able to think of that as a form of persecution, whereas somebody looking at you the wrong way or thinking you're weird probably doesn't rise to that level. So I just think that's something for us to think about. Like, okay, like, is this rising to a level of persecution or not? But then remember that, like, if you are being persecuted in the Lord's name, like, this is something to be expected. And so I think we should be expecting that, and we shouldn't be caught off guard by that, because it's told there in the book, like, you will be persecuted in my name. So that was something that I found really interesting this week. And then the second point that we had in the sermon is to trust God with your reputation. And this is a tough one, because for me, this is not one that I think I do a very good job of. I like for people to have like certain opinions of me. I don't like to be kind of made fun of. I'm a little weird that way. So it was a little bit of a rough point for me. And it was interesting in the sermon we're talking about. There's two ways that we can sort of go in the wrong direction here. And one is that we can have a tendency to fight whatever label is being put on us, whether it's like, you're a weird Christian, you're crazy, you're a Jesus freak, something like this. We have a tendency to fight back, right? And say like, no, I'm not any of that stuff. I'm cool, I'm good. And then another thing we can do is we can shrink away from our faith and back off of it. And I think that's actually kind of the worst of the two there, when you start to back away from the faith because you're worried about the external expectations of you, and you're worried about the social implications of what's going to happen to you. And it's peer pressure. It's a real thing. I think we had Dave on a number of weeks ago, maybe like 4 weeks ago, I think. And he was kind of talking about, when you're younger, when you're a teenager, that's kind of like a huge thing. You always want to fit in with everybody. And so you have a tendency, especially at that age, to kind of like shrink away, like, oh, everybody else doesn't want to do this. Oh, maybe I shouldn't want to do this. But we have to stay strong in the faith, and I think that's an important point, especially if you're listening to this, if you're younger. You don't have to fit in with everybody. In fact, it's better if you have your own stance, if you have your own person that you can stand up for. Eventually, I think a lot of people will actually recognize that in the long run, even if they don't in the short run. And then the first part of that, having a tendency to fight the label, I think I tend to do that sometimes. Like I will, when people say, it's interesting in music, there's a lot of people who will look at Christian music and say, oh, Christian music is terrible. And I'll be the first person to kind of fight back that notion, be like, no, it's not terrible. Look at X, Y, Z, A, B. Look at all these options and try to like argue this point. But I never really thought about this before, but what I'm actually doing there is I'm actually trying to argue for myself. it's not really about the music. That's not really what I'm caring about. What I'm caring about is the follow through on that to myself and to my taste in music. And I never really thought about that before, that like part of what I'm doing there is trying to defend myself from this label that, oh, you're into stuff that isn't cool, you know? And so it's really interesting, but I do think I have this tendency to kind of fight back on this label of like being weird or being, you know, something that doesn't fit in. And so I think like depending on the person you are, it's going to be like different, and sometimes maybe there's a combination of the two. Maybe you try to fight the label and you shrink back a little bit depending on the situation that you're in, depending on the people that you're around. But I think for me especially, like this tendency to want to be cool and to not want to be labeled a certain way is something that I probably fight back more against than I should. And I should be sort of more accepting of being considered weird for Jesus, because Jesus is different, right? Like Jesus is not what the world stands for. The world is not what Jesus stands for. So if you start trying to fit into those ideas of what the world stands for, I think by definition, you're starting to slip away a little bit from what Jesus stands for and what we should be trying to stand for. So I thought that was a really strong point, and one that kind of hit home a little bit for me. So it was really good to kind of think through that. And then the third point that we had in the sermon is to rejoice in your reward. And your reward is in heaven, right? You know, the righteous will receive their reward in heaven. And it's a tough concept, right? It's this concept of like delayed gratification. So Jesus says, you will be persecuted in my name here on earth, but you will be rewarded in heaven. And I think it's like everyone struggles with delayed gratification a lot of the time, right? So it's like, oh, you can have a bigger reward here, but you have to wait for it. You know, you have to hold out to get this larger reward. And we all have a tendency to like, oh, can I have this now? Can I have this, you know, sooner? And then we have a tendency to, you know, sacrifice the larger reward for the smaller one if we can have that quicker. And that's not where our reward is in heaven, right? We have to wait for that. We have to have that delayed gratification. And I think it's also tough because to a certain extent, like heaven is kind of an abstract concept where we only know so much about it in the Bible. And so it's this thing that we don't really think about all that much, I think. We don't stay focused on it that much. And I think that, you know, we need to focus more on it and more on the concept of God in heaven as our reward. But it's tough when you're in the day-to-day life. You have all these things going on. You got work, maybe you got school, maybe you got different social clubs you're involved in, different schedules. Your schedule's changing all the time. And like a lot of the time, you know, we can look at like the cool thing that we can have tomorrow is like the thing that makes us happy, right? That instant reward is what we're looking for. And I think that we struggle with thinking about our eternal reward and delaying that gratification. And so I think one of the things that's interesting is like thinking about heaven and like what is heaven and what exactly, like we know we'll be worshiping God there. We know that, you know, we'll be in jubilation with the angels. And I think that maybe one of the things to help us kind of keep our mind in that is just sort of pondering heaven. And I think if you ponder heaven more and kind of like ask yourself like, oh, what is heaven? Like what could be there? like all of a sudden, I think it'll start to be in your mind more, and it'll help you stay focused on your eternal reward more. And so I think that one of the things that we need to do is to kind of have these triggers and these habits that we can form where, if something negative happens, then we have this habit, whether that's prayer, whether that's reading the Bible, but something to kind of get us back into a focus. It might be a church group, maybe a midweek church group or something like that. And a lot of times that's a good thing to have, like this habit thing, because we're all going to go through different things in our lives that are going to take our attention away and draw our attention away from God and away from our eternal reward and back to that day to day, that instant gratification that we all go through. And so this is something that I think we need to be thinking about going forward. And I kind of wish it was actually something we could like leave off on, because I think it's a good leaving point. But we are going to have like 2 more weeks that we're going to be doing this podcast for. But I think, like, if I was to talk to the people listening to this podcast and be like, if there's one thing that I want you to think about heaven, because I don't think we really do it that much. So like this week, like when you're at home, like when you're processing things, try to think about heaven, try to ponder heaven and ponder what heaven would be like with the realms of eternal glory, because it's something that I know I don't do it that much. And I feel like a lot of people maybe don't do it that much. So that's sort of my challenge this week for people. If you're listening to this podcast and you're looking for something this week, think a little bit more about heaven and like let that sort of fill you with joy, because that's really where our joy comes. It doesn't really come in this lifetime, right? Like the Bible talks about, the world just keeps getting worse, right? It's not going to get any better. So if you're waiting for the world to get better, it's probably not going to, and there's obviously ebbs and flows with different things. So maybe tomorrow's a little better than today. That can happen, right? But, on a whole, the world is just going to get worse. So we really need to be focused more on eternity and more on heaven. So that's all I got for you guys this week. Stay tuned for the last 2 weeks before we take our summer break. And if it's as hot there as it's been here, make sure you guys stay cool, stay hydrated, and I'll see you guys next week. Thanks.